Hello, everyone. My name is Miguel Melgar, and I am the head debate coach at Buffalo Grove High School. First, wanted to thank everyone for coming out today, as well as for the students of Stevenson High School for organizing this wonderful event. And I also wanted to recognize Representative Schneider for coming out today and for the solidarity that he has shown at a national level alongside his legislative leadership. But today we are gathered to celebrate Juneteenth, a day that marks the official end of slavery. Even though President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, it was limited in nature as it only applied to the states that were under Union control. It wasn't until June 19th of 1865 that all slaves were announced free after the 13th Army Corps made their way into Galveston, Texas, months after General Lee's surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse. This is a day that many of us have not heard about until this year, and a history that has been lost on our education system. But I am happy to report that today, the Senate has introduced legislation to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. If this passes, it will be a major step in preserving Black history and recognizing a major milestone in the fight for universal racial equity. But we are also here today and have been demonstrating in Buffalo Grove and in protests across the nation for weeks now to demand justice, action, and accountability for the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others who have been killed, injured, and or mistreated by the criminal justice system. And while the criminal justice system may be at the forefront of our national political conversation today, we must continue to pull apart the layers upon layers of structural violence that plague our nation's achievement of our common virtues, such as justice, equality, merit, opportunity, and mobility. Yale University psychologist Bandy Lee writes in her textbook, Violence, an Interdisciplinary Approach to Causes, Consequences, and Cures, that structural violence refers to a form of violence wherein social structures or social institutions harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. Although less visible, it is by far the most lethal form of violence through causing excess deaths and deaths that would not occur in more equal societies. Not only is it the deadliest violence, it grows exponentially as unequal power differentials are used to create more unequal structures. Yet, because these limitations are embedded within social structures, people tend to overlook them as nothing more than the ordinary difficulties of life. Examples of structural violence include health, economic, gender, and racial disparities. Derivative forms include cultural, political, symbolic, and everyday violence. Structural violence is also the most potent stimulant of behavioral violence in the form of homicides, suicides, mass murders, and war. It is therefore one of the most critical areas of violence studies to examine in our time. When we say that Black Lives Matter, we hope to shed light not only on the fact that African American lives have intrinsic moral value, but as an explicit acknowledgement that even today, the social structure of our society does not create an equal starting line for those who are born of a cultural minority, and that we must do better, that we can do better. We cannot let the powers that be continue to advance the narrative that structural violence is a falsehood, or that white privilege doesn't exist, or that we have made opportunity accessible to all people, regardless of who they are or what traits they were born with. If you made a sign, please hold it up. Look around you. These are people that have taken time out of their day to show a symbolic gesture that structural violence still exists and that we have more work to do. Even though Juneteenth was an historic victory in the struggle for racial equity, there is more work that has to be done. Structural oppression did not just magically disappear the moment that we ended slavery. It has only been expressed through different forms. Even though 1.2 million African Americans bravely fought against the Nazi regime in World War II, they were largely denied the housing and education benefits that they were legally due for serving our country. The History Channel notes that redlining, a decades-old practice of marking maps by race to characterize the risks of lending money and providing insurance, made purchasing a home even more difficult for black veterans. Lending froze out poorer neighborhoods, ensuring that loan assistance and insurance would be denied. And new white suburbs often came with overtly racist covenants that denied entry to black people. In 1947, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities went to black borrowers. These impediments were not confined to the South, notes historian Ira Katz-Nelson. In New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages issued by the GI Bill supported home purchases for non-whites. The original GI Bill ended in July 1956, and by that time, nearly 8 million World War II veterans had received education or training, and 4.3 million home loans worth $33 billion had been handed out. But most black veterans had been left behind. As employment, college attendance, and wealth surged for whites, disparities with their black counterparts not only continued but widened. There was, writes University of Chicago professor Ira Katz-Nelson, no greater instrument for widening an already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. Today, a stark wealth gap exists between black and white Americans. The median income for white households in 2017 was $68,000 according to the U.S. Census, and for black households, it was $40,258. In a 2014 social equity study from Duke University also shows that the average black family only owns 7 cents of assets to every dollar owned by an average white family. While some of this discrepancy may be explained by the residual effects of slavery or by redlining, there is still plenty that can be explained by the criminal justice system, and more specifically, the racially motivated war on drugs. As a political response to the peace and love counterculture of the 1960s, Richard Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Agency, also known as the DEA, in 1973. According to John Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor, the Nixon campaign had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Ehrlichman was directly quoted as saying in a 1994 interview with Harper's Magazine, quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." End quote. The History Channel furthers that in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan reinforced and expanded many of Nixon's war on drugs policies. In 1984, his wife Nancy Reagan launched the Just Say No campaign, which was intended to highlight the dangers of drug use. President Reagan's refocus on drugs and the passing of severe penalties for drug-related crimes in Congress and state legislatures led to a massive increase in incarcerations for non-violent drug crimes. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum prison sentences for certain drug offenses. This law was later heavily criticized as having racist ramifications because it allocated longer prison sentences for offenses involving the same amount of crack cocaine, which at the time was the primary drug of choice for black Americans, as powder cocaine, which was used more often by white Americans. 5 grams of crack triggered an automatic 5-year sentence, while it took 500 grams, or half a kilo of powder cocaine, to merit the same sentence, a ratio of 100 to 1. Critics also pointed to data showing that people of color were targeted and arrested on suspicion of drug use at higher rates than whites. Overall, the policies led to a rapid rise in incarcerations for nonviolent drug offenses from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. And in 2014, nearly half of the 186,000 people serving time in federal prisons in the United States had been incarcerated on drug-related charges, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The ACLU also found that in 1986, before the enactment of federal mandatory minimum sentencing for crack cocaine offenses, that the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 11% higher than for whites, but 4 years later, the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 50% higher. In 2003, whites constituted 7.8% and African Americans constituted more than 80% of the defendants sentenced under the harsh federal crack cocaine laws, despite the fact that more than 66% of crack cocaine users at that time in the United States were white or Hispanic. It is a state that Michelle Alexander has referred to as the new Jim Crow. And today, African Americans now serve virtually as much time in prison for a drug offense at 58.7 months as whites do for a violent offense at 61.7 months. Let me be clear. The criminal justice system discriminates against persons of color not by mistake, but by design. The structure of violence is transformed from the slavery industrial complex to the school-to-prison pipeline that has been in place for decades and is still in place today. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, we spend $51 billion a year on the war on drugs, and yet overdose deaths are more than triple now than what they were just 20 years ago. And research from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which is a federal research institute that is taxpayer funded and a division of the National Institute of Health, has found that for every dollar that we spend on public health treatment of drug abuse and in treating addiction, that we save upwards of $12 in related criminal justice and healthcare costs. A drug addiction should not lead to an arrest and a conviction. It should lead to a diagnosis and a treatment. The drug courts model has been repeatedly tested around the country, and those who are sentenced to mandatory rehabilitation programs and not incarceration end up experiencing lower rates of recidivism and more accessible chances to reintegrate back into society. The war on drugs has failed according to almost every single metric, unless you refer back to the original criteria of the Nixon administration, which was to disrupt the black community. That is their words and not mine. It creates a much meaningful context as to the claimed reason why Breonna Taylor was killed, because the police officers in question believed that her address was being used by a drug dealer. Even if that was the address of a known drug dealer, selling drugs is a reason to be arrested, not to be executed in your sleep. In response to her death, Louisville has passed what they call the Breonna Taylor Law, which is an abolition of no-knock warrants. While this is a step in the right direction, this is legislation that we need passed on a federal level. And our demands for criminal justice reform cannot stop with an end to no-knock warrants, because an end to police brutality is not enough. I stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but if we settle at merely demanding an end to police brutality, we sell ourselves short at achieving true racial justice. We must end the school-to-prison pipeline and advocate for an We must end the school-to-prison pipeline and advocate for an entire platform of proposals that will more holistically address the current state of structural violence inside of our criminal justice system. Things like the decriminalization of all nonviolent offenses, the decriminalization or legalization of marijuana at a federal level, the expungement of marijuana-related offenses for criminals who live in states like Illinois, where the recreational use is no longer a crime. The treatment of drug abuse is a public health issue, not an issue of criminal justice. An independent FBI investigation for all deaths that are caused by police officers or in police custody. The elimination of qualified immunity. The elimination of the plea bargaining system, which has historically punished whites and blacks with drastically different levels of sentencing. An end to cash bail. The eradication of the felony conviction box. An end to the 3 strikes rule. Forbidding political campaigns and private corporations from exploiting and profiting from prison labor. A federal ban on the use of private prison facilities. A total crackdown and abolition of civil asset forfeiture. Mandating body cameras on all police officers. The ability to review any body camera footage by the filing of a Freedom of Information Act request. Meaningful reentry programs for recently released offenders, stricter use of force standards, the phasing out of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other militarized weapons that would be considered a war crime if it was used against an international civilian, but that are still used against nonviolent protesters in our own country. It's a violation of the Geneva Convention. Maintaining the ability for felons to vote in elections. You have a right to vote, not a privilege to vote in America. 11% of all black people have permanently lost the right to vote. Shooter bias tests imposed by every new candidate going through the police academy. And last but not least, a national public database that documents and archives all cases of police misconduct alongside federal standards that prevent disciplined and fired police officers from terrorizing new communities after they've been relieved of their duties in another. There's every reason to be outraged, but one of the largest reasons why Occupy Wall Street failed was because they did not have a list of demands. They did not have a platform. As we continue to defend the premise that the dreams, lives, and ambitions of minority men, women, and children have intrinsic worth, we have a duty to their humanity to push for concrete and measurable ways to make that a greater structural reality than we have today. Boston University professor Howard Zinn once said that if there is going to be change, real change, it will have to work its way from the bottom up, from the people themselves, that is how change happens. And just as our predecessors demanded that we change our approach to slavery, or our approach to school segregation, and to housing discrimination, we must push to fundamentally transform our approach to criminal justice. We still have a lot of work to do as a nation, but as I look around and I see the young activists today, the student leadership from places like Stevenson High School who have helped to organize this event today, I am confident that we are moving closer to a societal structure where your access to opportunity is not influenced by your level of melanin. Criminal justice reform is the civil rights issue of our time, and together we can deliver on making change happen. Thank you.